and welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, Ryan G. Brown.
Thanks, Ryan.
A lot of Ryans supporting us. Shout out to all the Ryans out there.
Yeah, if you want to be the next Ryan to support us, humanechoes.com/Patreon.
Or any other first name. Before I get into the meat of today's episode, Tony, I want to offer a little bit of a caveat. We're going to be talking about the Apple Computer Corporation, and we're going to be discussing them in a somewhat negative light, and I want people to know that I am not an Apple hater, but I'm also not a lover of them. I've been the kind of person who went for the cheaper and maybe slightly less quality product that still got the job done.
Yeah, well, that $1,200 MacBook has about a $400 PC's worth of power behind it, so you might have bought even better. But I'm also an Apple certified technician, so what do I know?
The point being, I don't have a bone to pick with Apple. I'm just going to talk about a specific product. If you want to hate more in general on Apple and Steve Jobs, that's your job.
They make pretty things. I'll give them that.
When Apple Computers launched the Apple II personal computer in 1977, they assumed that it would appeal mostly to hobbyists, computer nerds who just wanted to tinker around with their own version of the kind of machine that had filled a room only a decade earlier. Those were the people who had bought the limited number of Apple I's that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had built and sold early in their careers. But the Apple I's had been bare bones, a collection of chips soldered to a bare circuit board. If you wanted to do anything with it, you had to put in a lot of your own work. In contrast, the Apple II was a fully self-contained system with the keyboard built into the case of the computer. And with the release of third-party software like VisiCalc that ran on the system with virtually no need to understand the guts of the computer, it should have come as no surprise that businesses started buying the machines to help them balance their books. And today, this might not seem like such a big deal, Tony, because spreadsheets are maybe the most boring thing that you can think of. But before computers, you were doing all of that stuff on an actual piece of paper.
Yeah, the spreadsheets were a lot weirder. Like I had a professor that used to talk about like doing the double column books whenever he was an accountant back in like the 60s and 70s. It was so foreign to me, like the idea of doing that.
Right, and so the fact that you could just turn on a digital machine and alter those numbers and it would do the adding and subtracting basically automatically, that was a huge revolution. Up to 90% of the Apple IIs sold were being bought by the business market. And Apple's reaction to this was fascinating. They said to themselves, we've got a problem. The wrong people are loving the product that we built.
Oh no, we have to make money off of these people.
It's baffling to me, but I guess they had it in their mind that Apple II is for hobbyists, businesses buying them. Oh no, they're struggling by with this terrible computer that we built for just some nerds in their mom's basements. We have to do something. And the thing they decided to do was to make a new product. The reasoning ran as follows. If 90% of the market for our hobby computers is businesses, then if we make a business computer, we can sell it to everyone who's making do with this hobby computer. So Apple canceled nearly all of the development on the Apple II and put all its eggs in the Apple III basket.
So what were the criticisms? Were they saying it wasn't powerful enough to do this sort of accounting software? Was it not stable enough? What did they think was the main problem here?
Well, they wanted to upgrade some things. The biggest advantage that stood out to me was that it would have more columns of text on the display. So in the olden days, before you were really talking about resolution, you were talking about columns of text. The Apple II natively shipped could display 40 columns of text. So in other words, if you wrote all the way across the screen without hitting any spaces, you would type 40 letters before it would go to a new line. The Apple III would have 80 columns of text, which you can see being good, right? If you're running a spreadsheet, you want to have more room to do that stuff. If you're a writer, maybe you want to have a little bit more information fit on the screen.
Yeah, considering, like, if you're talking about tweet length, you'd have, like, an entire page filled up by a single tweet, whatever, it's like 40 letters. Not that there was a Twitter back then, but still.
There was also the fact that the Apple II couldn't do lowercase letters. It was only uppercase that it displayed. And the thing that's interesting, and we'll maybe get into this a little bit later, the Apple II got upgraded in various ways where it could do 80 columns of text. People were, I think, at some point doing lowercase letters, although that might not be true. But even so, Apple themselves said, no, we're not shipping this with those features. That's what the Apple III is for.
So it's just like, let's hamstring our good system that's selling a lot.
Well, that's sure what Steve Wozniak thought.
Did he disagree with getting rid of the Apple II?
If you've seen the movie Steve Jobs?
I have not.
A big portion of that movie, at least one of the pieces of it, is Steve Wozniak complaining that Steve Jobs is not supporting the Apple II enough, despite the fact that it's selling very well and is a good system. Steve Jobs was always about, like, what's the new thing? What's the next thing? And that would continue on with the Lisa and the Macintosh. Throughout all of those computers' release, the Apple II is still selling and selling relatively well. Anyway, moving back to the Apple III. Apple decided that since they were designing a computer for businesses to run spreadsheets on, the very first thing they needed to do was make sure the case looked good. Steve Jobs worked with designer Jerry Manick to design the case. Jobs hated what he said was the industrial sound of cooling fans, and he refused to include them on the Apple II and also many of the other computers that Apple built at the time. So instead, the case would have to be made out of solid aluminum, which would, in theory, absorb and dissipate the heat created by the computer. So there's a lot of stuff that comes into this decision. In the first place, we all know about Steve Jobs and his love of pretty things. So we have that going on. He's designing the look of the computer before the actual hardware has been finalized. Secondly, they're doing this heat sink thing with the aluminum, hopefully pulling the heat away from the CPU enough where they don't need a cooling fan. And then there's also the fact that their computers are throwing off a lot of radio interference, and the government's looking side-eye at them like, we don't like that, you better cut that out. And they know regulations are coming, so they're trying to get ahead of whatever the regulations are going to be.
So it's basically a race against time, against regulation, because they don't want to put proper shielding on this?
Oh, no, they are putting proper shielding, or what they hope is proper shielding. So they don't know what the specs are going to be. They know they're throwing off more interference than the government. I forget which agency deals with radio, but more than they want. FCC. I think you're correct. The FCC's looking at them like, you guys are doing, they haven't started putting that sticker on that says this device will receive interference and doesn't cause any interference, but they're about to. And so Apple's trying to get ahead of that by having this aluminum case absorb most of the radio waves popping out. But because they're doing aluminum casting, it takes a long time for them to cast all this aluminum, and so they have to get that in the bag before they're even done designing the hardware, so the aluminum cases can be produced in time for the computers to ship when the hardware is ready. The insides of the computer, when they were finally designed, had problems too. The engineering team became fixated on fitting all of the components for the computer onto a single board for little other reason that I could find than because it seemed like a neat idea. The problem with this was that it required smaller traces on the circuit board. Traces are the lines on the circuit board that carry current from one component to the next, and the traces on the Apple II were so thin and so tightly spaced that current could occasionally jump from one trace to another, causing the computer to fail. All of these factors came together in a perfect storm of problems, best summed up by Apple III marketing manager Taylor Pullman. Quote, There was way too short a time frame in manufacturing and development. When the decision was made to announce, there were only 3 Apple IIIs in existence, and they were all wire-wrapped boards. Essentially, somebody had just soldered some stuff together and had components hanging off. It was not anywhere near finalized.
That definitely works.
Continuing the quote, the case of the Apple III had long since been set in concrete, so they had a certain size logic board to fit the circuits on. They went to 3 different outside houses, and nobody could get a layout that would fit on the board. They used the smallest line circuit boards that could be used. They ran about 1,000 of these boards as pre-production units to give to dealers as demonstration units. They really didn't work. Finally, a woman at Apple succeeded in doing a better layout on the board, and Apple swapped out the boards. The problem was, at this point, there were other problems. Things like chips that didn't fit. There were a million problems that you would normally take care of when you do your pre-production and pilot run. Basically, customers were shipped the pilot run. End quote.
Yeah, whenever you're doing business, you really want to have that pilot program.
No one at Apple could see these problems coming, though. And in order to generate excitement for the product, Steve Jobs rented out all of Disneyland for several hours for the new computer's launch party. This seemed like a really big bash. It was $40,000 to rent Disneyland out completely at the time, and he also hired a bunch of bands. They're really trying to pump up this product. And on May 19th, 1980, Apple released the Apple III to the world. And it didn't work.
So they just launched a broken computer.
If your Apple III powered on at all, it failed after a few hours of use. Partly because, in addition to all the other issues with the design, the chips were often poorly seated in their sockets, which led Apple to actually suggest that Apple III owners lift their computers several inches off the desk and drop them to reseat the chips.
I'm just trying to think of what it would be like if I picked up my computer and dropped it. This one's pretty solid, so it'd probably be okay. My laptop, anything over 6 inches, and I'm looking at a brand new laptop.
Well, they weren't saying lift it way high up in the air, and they didn't even say lift the whole computer. You would pick it up from the front, a kind of hinge style, and then just let it pop down onto the desk. And, that would solidify some of the connections for a while.
It seems like something that would have happened during shipping.
I think the problem was during shipping, things got shaken loose. Again, part of the problem. There are many claims that Steve Jobs' insistence on not having a cooling fan was what caused this problem of the chips not being properly seated, that the board essentially warped and changed shape after a certain amount of use, and that was because of the heat buildup inside. The designer of the aluminum case, I saw him give a talk, and he talked extensively about how he believes that was not the case, and that it was, in fact, the chipset, the thing that the chips were actually placed into, not being the correct size for the chips, that was the problem. And I'm inclined to believe that because they redesigned this thing a little bit after all of these problems. And they don't include a fan in the redesign, and that does eventually work. So the heat was not an overwhelming problem. It could have been done. It eventually would be done. But not before every single one of the original 14,000 units that Apple shipped failed and had to be recalled.
Every single one.
100% failure rate on the initial Apple IIIs.
It's like, I remember when the Xbox 360 had like a 50% red ring of death in that first 2 years. I didn't think I'd see a product that was 100% a failure with an Apple logo on it.
Well, these are the early days, so,
But this is their business premium model.
It was the premium model. Although, interestingly enough, in all the things they added, they took away color monitors. They had color on the Apple II, and they're like, businesses don't care about color. Taking all that away.
They just need to be as drab as possible.
And there is a certain place for monochrome on these old-style monitor layouts. Like, you can definitely see why, again, if all you're doing is running a spreadsheet, maybe that would be appealing. But they actually removed features in this more expensive, supposedly more advanced computer, and that didn't help them at all. As I mentioned earlier, Apple redesigned the Apple III. They fixed the problems with the board, with the traces being too close together, and by all accounts, once they'd gotten the bugs out of the system like they should have in the first place, the computer worked really well. Every source that I could find said that the underlying architecture of the Apple II was really, really strong, and people at Apple super believed in it. But by that time, the damage had been done in public opinion. On top of the terrible publicity the machine had received, because it was using completely different architecture from the Apple II, there were almost no programs available for it. So they built this machine for people to be able to run VisiCalc on that they couldn't run VisiCalc on. The Apple III did include an emulator that simulated the Apple II, but it was intentionally locked out of certain features that Apple wanted to be exclusive to the Apple III. So for instance, that 80 columns of text that I mentioned earlier, big selling point if you're running a spreadsheet, people had already developed video cards for the Apple II that would display its output in 80 columns, but if you ran the emulator for the Apple II on the Apple III, it did not output in 80 columns, even though the monitor was perfectly capable of doing that.
I just don't understand locking it down, but that's always been their MO. Like, they just always have these weird things that you cannot do on their systems.
They wanted to tell you which system that you were going to use, rather than listen to, oh, hey, you love these features? We'll continue to develop those. And the thing is, this almost harkens back to the old Ford Edsel thing, where there's an inter-business competition. There are engineers that have been hired on by Apple to do nothing but develop things for the Apple III, and Steve Wozniak's kind of over in his corner by himself, like, coding stuff for the Apple II to make it better, and the engineers for the Apple III are like, what are you doing? Shooting our computer in the foot, making your computer that everybody loves even better. Stop making it better. And this was despite the fact that, as we mentioned already, the Apple II had a much larger user base. What was worse for Apple was that 1 year later, IBM released their business PC to massive market success. Apple argued that their machine was technically better, and now that the bugs were worked out, there was no reason not to buy it, but the public simply couldn't stomach the name Apple III after so many initial failures.
Yeah, I would have been trying to just be, like, completely as far away from that as possible. The Apple III, like, upgrade kind of looks cool, though. Like, for the time.
Yeah, I mean, even the Apple II is kind of a neat concept. I sort of wish there was still this kind of system where it's a computer in a keyboard. That seems like a neat form factor, and I understand why it has gone by the wayside, but it seems like a neat kind of way to ship your computer. It almost seems like an all-in-one type system like you could get now, but with the keyboard being the included component instead of the monitor. Apple discontinued the Apple III in 1984, having sold only 120,000 units in that time. In comparison, the Apple II would continue to be sold in some form or another until 1993, and the IBM PC, well, that would go on to fundamentally change the world of computing. Apple III could have been a winner for Apple, but it failed because the marketing and engineering departments could never quite get on the same page, and because its production was rushed, it was shipped to market with major problems that hurt its image forever. And that's it, Tony. That's the story of the Apple III as well as I could tell it. It's just mind-boggling to think of a machine having 100% failure rate out the door. And you can understand why Apple tried to revive the brand, and it just ultimately ended up being throwing good money after bad.
It's amazing that they were able to recover from this, too. To have a 100% failure rate and try to stop your Apple II production, which is like selling well, and go after something that just did so poorly. That would sink so many companies.
They didn't stop the production so much of the Apple II. They just stopped trying to improve it and develop things for it, like programs and things that would make it a little bit better. everything as far as product design and new ideas, all of anything that could be improved. They're like, we're not improving that old thing anymore. We're just going to go with the new thing. And you can kind of understand why maybe you would want to do that. It certainly worked out in some cases.
And it's what they still do today with phones after a certain point.
Yeah, well, that's even a whole different thing where it's like, we've upgraded your operating system to the point where your phone no longer works.
Yeah.
They keep upgrading it until it breaks it. But that is it. That is what we have to say about the Apple III. I really enjoyed researching this. It got into some technical stuff that I wasn't fully able to appreciate, Tony. I hope that nobody's angry that I've left out the story of the internal clock that failed on this thing, because I actually couldn't bring myself to care that broke.
I think the only technical stuff I would have wanted to know is like what the levels of RAM and the processor and things like that were, just because it's so astounding how far we've come with that.
Well, I didn't mention in my notes, but the thing that was big about the Apple III that the Apple II didn't have was a hard drive.
So it actually had like physical media instead of having just floppies and stuff running off of like
it would have been
chip.
Tapes for the early Apple II. Eventually they get
I forgot it was
two
tapes.
floppies. But again, we're real early in the days of computers here. But again, the Apple II architecture would have worked perfectly well with a hard drive. And eventually they would include hard drives with the Apple II. It was just one of those situations where they're like, no, you're in the wrong ecosystem, and we're telling you what the right ecosystem is, and you are going to change. And that's not how the market works, Tony.
That is not.
We really appreciate you guys listening. Thank you guys so much. If you enjoyed this, you should click on that like button over on YouTube, or tell a friend if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, or leave us a review on iTunes or other places that you can leave reviews for podcasts. I don't know how all that works exactly. None of the Android things let you leave a review, Tony. That's one place where Apple has Android beat. If you really,
except for the fact that iTunes doesn't like exist in the same way anymore. You have to go to the podcast app and leave reviews.
If you really love us, though, sorry. And if you really love us, you should check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/humanechoes, where you get access to these episodes a whole week early, and you get access to things like the bonus podcast, where we just kind of shoot the breeze for a while. We just recorded one of those this morning. Had a delightful time doing it, Tony.
Yep,
if you have ideas you want us to cover, you should check us out. You should send us an email at badideasshow@gmail.com. We will see you guys next week with another bad idea.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.